Welcome to the Week 12 Forum. This week, as I noted in the overview, we are looking at whether or not federalism is to blame for the various policy failures that occasioned the landfall of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. A lot of the political scientists and election analysts look at the Bush administration's response to Katrina as one of the crucial events that began to unravel George W. Bush's popularity and his approval ratings. First his attempt to in the aftermath of his reelection, encouraged the spread of democracy throughout the Middle East, contributed to the Arab Spring, with all the good and bad consequences that came with that. Then came his attempt to privatize Social Security, and he committed an enormous amount of time and political capital to what proved to be a failed effort. And then along came Katrina, which many liberals characterized as a comprehensive failure on the part of the Bush administration to respond. And the result was you literally had dead bodies floating in a major U.S. city as a result. The authors of this article are asking a specific question. Was federalism in particular to blame for this particular policy failure? Their response, as you might expect, is somewhat nuanced, but it boils down largely to the conclusion that there were significant failures at the federal level, but there were also intergovernmental networking failures that contributed to the botched execution of Katrina response, relief, and recovery efforts. In addition to giving us a better understanding of why Katrina was such a catastrophe, this article hopefully will lend us some insight into why hurricane response to Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico, or Hurricane Florence that hit North and South Carolina, or Hurricane Michael and its recent devastation of the Florida Panhandle. I mean, hopefully, if we're understanding how federalism deals, how federalism has evolved as a policy, or how federalism has influenced disaster response, we might have a better idea of what's going wrong and what we can do better. To me, one of the most important takeaways for this article are the contrasting interpretations of federalism as it relates to the federal government's responsibilities in disaster relief. Democrats, certainly after Carter, clearly recognized that aggressive disaster response was a powerful rhetorical device for serving key constituents. I think that Clinton and both Obama and Clinton recognized that people want a government response. People want the federal government to be seen doing something. In contrast, Republican presidents since Reagan have tended to view disaster response as frankly secondary to civil defense considerations. Am I being fair in this characterization? Does this interpretation lend insight into how partisanship affects this aspect of public policy, which again, disaster response? Another point of emphasis of the article is that the distribution of responsibilities has historically been heavily tilted towards state and local governments. A consequence of this distribution of responsibilities is that areas exposed to frequent disaster level weather events tended to be relatively sparsely populated. Alternatively, those areas that were subject to those kind of weather events were also generating levels of economic activity that would justify significant investments in disaster mitigation infrastructure. To think about this, Buffalo. Why Buffalo? Why is there Buffalo? With all the snow and all the crazy stuff that they get. Well, evidently they're producing enough economically that they can invest really heavily in snow removal, right? Comparatively, what's the most significant threat that Oklahoma as a state faces? Tornadoes, right? And boy, do we ever invest in storm tracking infrastructure. Another issue is that when relatively low income communities get hit badly enough, certainly previously there was a very real likelihood that those communities were not going to be able to rebuild, and that's just, I guess you could chalk it up to the idea of creative destruction. But in a lot of instances, that was the state of things in the middle of the 20th century, and that's where the federal government has increasingly stepped in as a result of a series of really bad storms. In 1988, Congress passed the Stafford Act with successive amendments. The Stafford Act really asserted a role for the federal government. But what was the nature of that role? Does the Stafford Act mean that the federal government has effectively preempted state and local government responsibilities? That appears to be the impression that the media frequently conveys to the American public. But is that the reality? The authors are pretty clear that state and local governments continue to take on the responsibility as first responders, and they have planning responsibilities. Are state and local governments always well positioned enough to perform that first response responsibility? What did Katrina reveal about the Gulf Coast's first response capabilities? Remember, Louisiana and Mississippi are both relatively low-income states. Another important dot that Birkeland and Waterman connect is the impact of 9/11 on the key federal disaster agency, which was created by Jimmy Carter in 1979 as a means of consolidating disparate relief, disaster relief agencies. So when Katrina happened, the Federal Emergency Management Agency had only been in existence for 26 years. That's relatively young. For 24 of those 26 years, FEMA had been an independent executive agency, similar to the FBI and the CIA. That effectively meant that the FEMA director had at least potentially direct reporting privileges to the president. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a FEMA director could just walk into the Oval Office or even call directly. But Republican presidents generally understood FEMA and its responsibilities to be primarily focused on nuclear survivability. And in George Herbert Walker Bush's term, remember 1988 to 1993, or 1989 to 1993, FEMA, the Cold War ended. So for a lot of Republican civil servants, much of the agency's responsibilities kind of dissipated. So that changed when Bill Clinton came into office, and that's sort of like a golden age for FEMA. Clinton gave James Lee Witt, who was a fellow Arkansan, who had helped organize Arkansas's emergency management agency. He gave Witt a great deal of authority, a great deal of responsibility, in large part because he trusted Witt, and significantly because Clinton believed that an aggressive federal response would would work to his benefit. Now, in 2003, FEMA's status as an independent agency changed, right? And FEMA became part of the newly created Department of Homeland Security. How did that alter FEMA's mission? More importantly, what impact did that change have on FEMA's senior leadership? How did George W. Bush view FEMA? And how does that impact FEMA's subsequent behavior and its performance during Hurricane Katrina? The one last issue I want to point to is the way that the media covered the slow motion disaster that was left in Katrina's wake. How did the papers of record like the New York Times and the electronic media cover Katrina? What did they focus on? How does Birkeland and Waterman contrast the mainstream media's coverage of the policy failures related to Katrina with, for example, the New Orleans-based Times-Picayune's coverage? What was their focus? And what does that suggest about, sort of the accuracy of how the media relates what's going on in the world? So hopefully I've given you a lot to think about, to discuss, and I think there's a lot of additional material to consider. Let's have a great discussion this week.